She didn't need the whole picture anymore for a long time. She believed obedience required clarity, a sense of direction, a visible path, some assurance of where things were going. She wanted to know the outcome before taking the step. She wanted confirmation before committing. She wanted to feel safe before trusting. But life with God kept reducing the map. Not all at once, slowly, deliberately. What once felt like a long road became a single step. What once felt like a clear plan became a quiet invitation. Follow me. And that unsettled her, because giving God control of the next step meant releasing control of the future. It meant trusting God without knowing what would come after. Obeying without seeing where obedience would lead. Moving without understanding how things would unfold. She realized that most of her anxiety was not about the present. It was about the steps she could not see yet. The what-ifs, the outcomes, the consequences, the fear of choosing wrong. God wasn't asking her to trust Him with everything at once. He was asking her to trust Him with this step. Today. Here. Now. And that felt harder than surrendering a distant future. Because the next step is where faith becomes practical. It is where trust leaves theory and enters daily life. She learned that God rarely gives the full plan, not because He is withholding, but because relationship requires proximity. He wanted her close, attentive, dependent, so He gave her enough light for the step in front of her and asked her to walk. Giving God control of the next step meant saying, I don't need to know what's next, as long as I know you're here. It meant releasing the pressure to figure everything out, letting go of the need to feel ready, choosing obedience over understanding, and in that quiet surrender, she realized something sacred. God was not leading her step by step because He wanted to limit her. He was leading her this way because He wanted her to trust Him. If you've ever felt anxious about what comes next, if you've wished God would show you more before asking you to move, if faith has felt heavy because you wanted certainty, stay. This message is for the woman who is learning that God does not guide us with maps, but with presence. And if these words already feel like the place you're standing in, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when God asks you to take the next step, without seeing the whole road. Now let's walk through what changes when she finally gives God control of the next step. She didn't ask for control because she wanted power. She asked for it because she wanted safety. Knowing the whole plan felt like protection. It allowed her to prepare emotionally, to manage expectations, to brace herself for disappointment before it arrived. If she could see the road ahead, she believed she could survive it better. So she asked God for clarity. Not once, but repeatedly. What comes next? Where is this leading? How long will this take? Will this be worth it? And when those answers didn't come, unease settled in, because uncertainty feels threatening to a heart that has been hurt before. She had learned, often the hard way, that surprises could wound, that trusting blindly could cost her, that stepping forward without certainty could lead to pain. So wanting the whole plan felt wise. It felt like discernment. It felt like responsibility. It felt like maturity. But beneath that desire was fear. Fear of choosing wrong. Fear of wasting time. Fear of obedience leading somewhere she didn't want to go. God saw that fear clearly, and He did not shame it. Instead, He invited her to trust differently. God knew that if He gave her the whole plan, she would rely on the plan, not on Him. She would trust the roadmap instead of the guide, the clarity instead of the presence. So God offered something smaller, the next step, not the destination, not the timeline, not the explanation, just enough light to move forward today. This felt uncomfortable because trusting the next step means trusting God repeatedly. Not once, not in theory, but every single day. It requires waking up and asking, God, where are you leading now? Instead of, God, where is this all going? She began to see the difference. The whole plan promised control. The next step required relationship. The whole plan reduced anxiety temporarily. The next step trained her trust deeply. The whole plan created distance. The next step created dependence. God was not withholding information to frustrate her. He was shaping her to walk closely with him, and slowly, she realized something profound. Her peace had never come from knowing the future. It had always come from knowing God was with her. So God asked her to release the need to see far ahead and learn to stay present, to obey in small ways, to trust in daily decisions, to follow without demanding certainty. Giving God control of the next step was not reckless, it was faithful, because faith does not require vision. It requires obedience, and obedience, one step at a time, was becoming the place where her trust finally learned to rest. What made the next step so difficult was not the step itself. It was what she couldn't see beyond it. She realized that her resistance was less about obedience and more about outcomes. She was willing to follow God as long as she knew where obedience would lead, as long as she could predict what it would cost her, as long as she could prepare herself for the consequences. But God was asking her to obey without guarantees, and that exposed a deeper fear, the fear of investing faith and not receiving what she hoped for, the fear of trusting fully and being disappointed again, the fear of choosing obedience and discovering it led through loss. She had obeyed before and still suffered. She had trusted before and still been hurt. She had followed God before and still faced confusion. So obedience without outcome felt dangerous. She asked herself quietly, what if I do everything God asks and still don't get what I'm praying for? That question lingered, because faith without outcome feels like standing exposed with no safety net. But God did not answer that fear with explanation. He answered it with presence. He reminded her, not through words, but through relationship, that obedience is not a transaction. It is not a bargain. It is not leverage. It is not a guarantee of comfort. Obedience is trust expressed in action, and trust does not require knowing how things will turn out. It requires knowing who you are trusting. She began to understand that her fear of unknown outcomes was rooted in a subtle belief that obedience should protect her from pain. But God had never promised a painless path. He promised companionship. He promised faithfulness. He promised to walk with her through whatever came. And slowly, that truth began to settle. She didn't need to know how the story would unfold to take the next step. She needed to know that God would not leave her in the unfolding. The outcome was not the anchor. God was. Giving God control of the next step meant trusting Him not only with direction, but with consequence. It meant believing that even if obedience led through difficulty, God's presence would be enough. And for the first time, she saw obedience differently. Not as a risk to manage, not as a cost to calculate, but as a place where God meets His daughters personally. She realized something sacred. God does not reveal outcomes to secure our obedience. He invites obedience to deepen our trust. And that shift began loosening her grip on the future. Giving God control of the next step did not remove her fear. It taught her how to move with it. She realized that courage was not the absence of hesitation. It was obedience in its presence. Each step felt small, almost insignificant, but those small steps required real trust. Trust to wake up and follow God again without knowing what tomorrow would bring. Trust to say yes today without guarantees for next week. Trust to keep walking without asking God to prove where the road would end. She learned that God rarely leads in leaps. He leads in increments. One decision, one conversation, one act of obedience, one surrender at a time. And that frustrated her at first because she wanted momentum. She wanted progress she could measure. She wanted confirmation that she was moving in the right direction. But God was not building speed. He was building dependence. Each step trained her to listen more closely, to pray more honestly, to rely less on plans and more on presence. She noticed something unexpected. When she focused on the next step, her anxiety about the future softened. Not because fear disappeared, but because it no longer controlled her. She didn't have to solve tomorrow. She only had to be faithful today. And that made faith livable. She stopped carrying the weight of decisions God hadn't asked her to make yet. Stopped stressing over paths He hadn't revealed. Stopped demanding clarity before obedience. She trusted that God would speak again when the next step came. And He did, not loudly, not dramatically, but faithfully. God met her at each step she took, not ahead of her, not behind her, with her. She realized then that God's guidance is relational, not informational. He doesn't hand us instructions and walk away. He walks beside us, step by step. Giving God control of the next step did not make life predictable. It made it personal. And that changed how she trusted. Because faith was no longer about seeing far. It was about staying close. As she continued walking step by step, she noticed something important. Trust was no longer something she felt. It was something she chose. Some days, she felt peaceful. Other days, she felt uncertain again. But her obedience no longer depended on emotional clarity. She learned that faith is not sustained by confidence. It is sustained by commitment. Commitment to listen, commitment to respond, commitment to take the next step, even when emotions wavered. She stopped asking herself, "Do I feel ready?" and began asking, "Is God asking me to move here?" This shifted everything, because feelings change. Fear rises and falls. Confidence comes and goes. But obedience remains available. Every single day. She realized that God was not waiting for her to feel fearless. He was inviting her to trust Him, even when fear whispered. Giving God control of the next step meant trusting Him in ordinary moments, in daily decisions, in quiet obediences, in choices no one else noticed. There were no big revelations, no dramatic confirmations, just faith expressed in consistency, and that consistency began to steady her life. She felt less pressure to rush, less need to impress, less anxiety about getting everything right, because faith was no longer about arriving somewhere. It was about walking with someone. She learned that God does not require perfect trust. He honors willing trust. Trust that shows up. Trust that listens. Trust that moves. Even when certainty is absent. Giving God control of the next step did not remove uncertainty, but it removed paralysis. She no longer stood frozen, waiting for clarity. She walked, slowly, humbly, faithfully. And that was enough. In the end, she never received the full plan. She received something better. She received guidance. Not all at once, but daily. Not far ahead, but right where she was, she learned that God does not reveal the whole road because He wants us dependent, not lost. He does not guide from a distance. He walks with us. Giving God control of the next step was not about surrendering intelligence or responsibility. It was about surrendering fear, fear of choosing wrong, fear of missing out, fear of not knowing what comes next. She stopped demanding certainty and started trusting presence. And in that trust, she found peace. Not the peace of knowing everything, but the peace of knowing God was near. If you are standing at a place where you can't see ahead, where God hasn't given the full picture, where the next step feels small but scary, let this be your reminder. You don't need the whole plan to be faithful. You only need to trust God with the next step. And if you want a place to return, when obedience feels quiet and trust feels ordinary, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey. Because the God who calls you forward does not abandon you. Between steps, He walks with you, one faithful step at a time.